Pastor Gary wanted a talk that's going to be much more practical. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to deal with FAQs, frequently asked questions, the ones that you're going to get when you talk to Muslims, and I hope you all do. I hope all of you have the chance to talk to Muslims. I find them to be the most engaging people to talk to. Now, I've been doing it for 37 years, but certainly I find Muslims are all asking the right questions, more so than anybody else. The questions they ask tend to always fall into two categories. One is on the person of Jesus Christ, and the other category would be on the Bible. And those are the two categories I want to talk about. I'm sure they're the ones you want to talk about. And the only people who will talk about Jesus and the Bible are Muslims. I find with other people, they just walk away. Even when I bring it up and I say, let's talk about Jesus Christ, they usually walk away. And I always tell my students, always ask those two questions. When you go up to a student or when you go up to a Muslim, ask them just two things. Just say two things to them. I believe that Jesus is God, and I believe the Bible is the Word of God. Do you have an opinion? And you're going to get lots of opinion. This is what we've been doing in London, in England, where I've been for the last 25 years. And every Sunday, we go down to a place called Speaker's Corner. Any of you know about Speaker's Corner? Okay, a few of you. Have any of you been to Speaker's Corner? Gary, at the very back. Did you ever get up on a ladder, Gary? No. Oh, dear. Well, we should have had you up if you'd come when I was there. Every Sunday, we get up on a ladder, and I'm about as high as I am right now. I feel right at home because I'm this high up. Just 2 steps, these little kitchen ladders that you have in your kitchen, just so our heads are above the crowd. And we take on sometimes hundreds. At times, we can even take on thousands of Muslims at a time. And the most radical Muslims come to Speaker's Corner. It's a magnet for radical Muslims. And the reason why is because most of your Muslims come from oral cultures. They come from countries where you give them a book, they'll throw it away. You give them a tract, they'll probably tear it up. They're not interested in reading tracts. They're not interested in reading books. They don't come from countries where they have an educational model like we have here in America that's based on reading books, writing essays, and writing papers. They hear, and then they memorize what they hear. And because of that, they love orality. They love people that actually can speak. And that's why they love videos more than anything else. And that's why I've been doing videos since 2006. We did a survey back in 2006 on YouTube. And at that time, we counted 43,000 videos that were attacking Christianity and only 17 that were taking on Islam. 43,000 versus 17. Guess who was ahead? What was interesting, though, was almost all the videos that were attacking Christianity were always on those two subjects. Now, there were some that were also, I shouldn't say all of them, but there were some that were on certainly the church and its history and some of the testimony of Christians around the world. But by far and large, they were all zeroing in on Jesus Christ. And I always found that curious, and I always want to know, why are they so interested in Jesus Christ? And as you go out and as you talk to Muslims, almost the first question that comes up will be about the Trinity. How many of you had that experience? How did you answer it? Did you actually make sense? That's a heresy right there. Don't ever do that again. That is Sabellian heresy right there, because God is not Father, Son, because you cannot separate the three. But before that, be careful. Understood, but don't use that. They will hammer you with that. That's a heresy. We don't use that one. In fact, don't use any model. Every model that I've heard is heretical. Water, steam, ice, just don't use them. The best thing to do is use your Bible. Just go back to the Bible. Open up your Bible. You're doing two things, and let me tell you why. When you work with Muslims, usually when they want to hammer you on the Trinity, it's because they want to find any chink in your armor. They really want to try to overpower you, and they know that you cannot answer it because very few Christians can define the Trinity and also defend it in 2 minutes. And that's all the time you're going to get. So most Christians do like this gentleman here. Father, brother, and what's the other one? Father, brother, and son. Don't use those just because they'll run circles around that, and they'll even show you where that came from, and they'll quote the scholar that first introduced it. So stay away from those models and try to get right back to the Bible. I'll tell you why. It does two things. It gets you back to where you want to be anyways. Because I don't care diddly swat about any of your opinions, and you don't care diddly swat about my opinion. And the Muslims don't care about our opinions. What they want to know is, can you show me where the Trinity is in the Bible? Not the word. Don't even look there. It's not there. In the same token, when they ask you, where is the Trinity, if it's such an important concept, why is it not in the Bible? Ask the same question right back in their lap and say, okay, how do you define God? And the way they define God is tawhid. Tawhid means oneness. It's an Arabic word. So ask them, find the word tawhid in the Quran. It's not there. Now, most Muslims aren't aware of that. They know God is one. They know He is Tawheed, but they all assume that they can find it in the Quran. You can't find it in the Quran. Try and see if you can look at it. No Muslim has been able to find that word. In the same token, we can't find Trinity for a very good reason. It's nothing more than a theological concept which was basically created by Tertullian in the late 2nd century, about 180, to define what we see in the Bible. Now, when I want to talk about the Trinity, and when I want to ask, and when Muslims throw it at me, there's one of two things you can do to help them out, because Muslims are not really looking for an answer. They know that you're not going to give a good answer that they'll be satisfied with. So what you need to do is you need to play the very idea of the Trinity against them. And one of the best things I have found is to ask them, what are the names of God in their Quran? There are 99 names for Allah. And the three most popular names for Allah is Al-Rahman, Al-Rahim, Al-Wadud. You don't have to remember them, they'll know them. Ask them, what's the very first surah? What's the very beginning of the very first surah? And you'll see two of the names right there in the Fatiha, in the very first verse of the Quran. Al-Rahman, Al-Rahim, Al-Wadud. Al-Rahman means the compassionate one. Al-Rahim means the merciful one. Al-Wadud means the loving one. Those are the three most common names, the most important names for Allah. Because Allah can only be defined by His names. They've never seen Allah. He has never come to earth. They've never had a relationship with Him. They've never seen Him face to face. Therefore, they're totally dependent on these names to describe Him. And these are His eternal names. They have always existed. You don't create names for yourself. You will always have a name. And so Allah has always had these names. So ask them, okay, compassionate, merciful, loving, good names, good names. There's a problem. All three of those names require an object, don't they? Am I correct? You have to be compassionate to someone. You have to be merciful to someone. You have to be loving to someone. Am I correct? You cannot have those names without an object. So where was the object of Allah's compassion, mercy, and love before Adam and Eve were created? We've got them. And I've yet to see a Muslim that can answer that question in 37 years. They've not thought through that if God is one, a monad, there's no possibility for relationship. There's no possibility that we can be made in His image, because we're relational animals, aren't we? Every one of us is compassionate. Every one of us is merciful. We're all loving. And the only way I can know that I'm loving is because I'm made in God's image. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27. Ooh, I love it. Since I'm made in His image, that's why I know that I'm relational. That's why I know that I have love. And that's why I know that as a human animal, we are unique and distinct, and we are made in God's image. And that's the beautifulness, because that means that God whose image I'm made in is also relational, which means God the Father has always loved God the Son. God the Son has always loved God the Holy Spirit. Can you now see where relationship comes from? And Muslims are also relational. They are also compassionate, loving, and merciful. So where do they get their love from? Unless they come on home to our God, the triune God. And what you have done, you've just come in through the back door. How long did that take me to do that? 2 minutes. And that's the beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Another question that comes up all the time is, how could God have a son? Have you heard this one? How could God have a son? And of course, when you ask them, what do you mean God have a son? Well, how could God the Father, marry the mother, Jesus the Son? That's how they define it. They have to do that because that's in the Quran, in chapter 5, verse 116. In the Quran, it's very simple. That God the Father, in fact, what it is, you have a question. You have Allah speaking to Isa, who is Jesus, in the Quran. Not my Jesus, but certainly one in the Quran. And he's saying to Issa, is it true that you and your mother are to be worshipped as God? Which implies that Mary is part of the Trinity. Now, Gary, do you teach that here at this church? Please say no. Did he say no? Have you heard anybody teach that at this church? Do you know of anybody in California that teaches that Mary is the mother of God? Please say no. Oh, you have? Okay, a heretical church, but certainly not an evangelical church and not a good God-fearing and Bible-believing church. We do not preach Mary as a part of the Trinity. Now, there are groups, and you are correct. In fact, historically, there are the Collyridians. There's a group there right there in the 7th century and the 8th century who possibly could have been the source for this problem. Because certainly in the Quran, whoever put the Quran together, and we're going to get to that, and Pastor Gary wants me to unpack that for you a little bit tonight, more after, little later on. But whoever put the Quran together obviously must have borrowed this from another source, and I think it's from this Collyridian group, because they did believe that Mary was the mother. They could have even got it from the Catholics, who seem to have Mary everywhere, all over their churches. Could be that that's where they got it from, but I assume that they had never read the Bible, whoever put the Quran together. And they certainly hadn't talked to any good Christians, because no Christian would put Mary up there as part of the Trinity. So how could God have a son? Now, the way to answer that is very simple. You're going to be my Muslim for tonight, okay? You've got a beard. You're perfect. I need someone with a beard. You guys don't have beards, sorry. We'll go to the guy with a beard, okay? If you're a beard, that means you're a religious man. You're supposed to have it about the size, about the length of your hand. It was? Shame on you. You've lost your religiosity. Nonetheless, you're going to be Abdul tonight, okay? So, Abdul, let me ask you real quickly. Where are you from? Bellflower. Are you a son of Bellflower? Oh, darn, you're not going to be any help for me then. I need someone who really likes where they're from. Here's a guy with even better beard. Where are you from? Where are you from?
Midway City.
Where?
Midway City, California.
What was it?
Midway City, California.
Beltway. Midway. Are you a son of Midway? Sure you are, and you're proud of it, right? Unlike this guy over here. He doesn't know where he's from. But you're proud that you are from Midway City. Am I correct? Now, does that mean that you have a biological relationship from Midway, that you were born from the ground of Midway? Absolutely not. But you are sure that you are a son of Midway. And that's all over the world. You can ask any Muslim from any country where they're from and ask them, are you a son of Cairo? Or are you a son of Egypt? Or are you a son of Jordan? Or are you a son of Pakistan? And they will all say, yes, we are sons, unlike this man right here. They are proud to be there, but in no notion do any of them consider themselves as biologically born from that environment. More than that, the Quran even accepts that. In chapter 2, verse 177, it says in the Quran that a traveler, someone who's going from one place to another, is a Ibn ul-Sabili. Ibn ul-Sabili means a son of the road. So in Arabic, it's perfectly legitimate to call someone who is traveling a son of the word. But no one reading that would assume that they were born from the ground of the road. There's no biological relationship at all between the traveler and the road itself. They relate to the road. It's a relational title. In Arabic, there are two words for son. One is ibn and the other is walid. And walid is biological. Ibn is always relational. So when Jesus says, because you have also ben in Hebrew, you can see that you have very much the same thing in Hebrew. When Jesus said he is the Ben Yahweh, he is the Son of God, whenever he used that title, nowhere did he ever intimate that he was a biological son of God. He related to God as a son to a father. And he has always been the Son of God, has he not? He always will be the Son of God. Am I correct? Which means there's nothing biological between God the Father and God the Son. What it does say is that if he relates to God as his Father, that means he inherits everything the Father inherits. Which means if Father is God, so is the Son. And this is one of the four major titles, divine titles, that we see in the New Testament, derived from the Old Testament. And this is one of the reasons why Caiaphas in the Sanhedrin in chapter 26 of Matthew, when he turns towards Jesus and asks him this very question, are you the Son of God? Are you the Messiah? And Jesus says, yes, it is as you say. And then Jesus went ahead and said, after that, and you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds, referring to Daniel chapter 7, verse 14, which is a third title for divinity. Messiah is the first, Son of God is the second, Son of Man is the third. By the way, that's the one the Muslims love the most. That's the one Muslims will throw at you. They will say, you Christians, see, Jesus more often than any other, 25 times in the New Testament, referred to himself as Son of Man. He's nothing more than a man. See, Mr. Smith, he's nothing more than a man. And I love that when they bring that up, because I take them right back to Matthew 26, to the trial by Caiaphas there in front of the Sanhedrin. And I say, look and see, when Jesus used this title for himself in front of Caiaphas, look at Caiaphas' reaction. He tore his robe, turned towards the Sanhedrin, and said, what further truth do we need? This man has blasphemed. Because he knew that in Daniel 7:14, the definition of the Son of Man is right there. The Son of Man is from everlasting to everlasting, will have dominion over all tribes, nation, peoples, and tongues. Folks, who is from everlasting to everlasting but God himself? Am I correct? Exactly. So in a sense, what Jesus was saying in those 3 verses from 62 to 60, actually it's up to 66, so those 4 verses, he was saying to Caiaphas, I am God, I am God, I am God. 3 times he was saying it. Muslims will ask you, where does Jesus ever say, I am God? Take them to Matthew 26. Just open up your Bible and you will see 3 times Jesus saying, I am God. To a Jew, he was saying, I am God. Not to an American, because Jesus never spoke English. He would not have used it in English. He would have said in Hebrew. Now, the 4th time, in one of the best places, I'm doing 2 things at once. I'm killing 2 birds with 1 stone. The other place where Jesus claimed to be God was in John chapter 8, verse 58. In John 8:58, he's there in the temple. He's speaking Hebrew because if he was in the temple, he would, of course, be speaking Hebrew. And they were questioning him and says, how could you know Abraham? You're not even 50 years old. And Jesus replied, before Abraham was, Yahweh. Yahweh. Ooh, I love that. He was using God's holy name. He was using God's unique name. He was using God's eternal name. And this is why when he used that name, that is the name that Moses needed. That is the name that Moses wanted before he went down to Egypt to bring back the Israelites. He said to God, what is your name? I need to know your name so they will know which God I am representing when I bring them back out of Egypt. And that's the name Jesus used right there in the temple. Before Abraham was, Yahweh. In Greek, egoemi. In English, I am who I am. I am that I am. Can you see now why it's so important that you know how to answer these questions real quickly? But don't just stop there by answering the questions. Show them why this is important. That's a brilliant question you asked about the Trinity. Because in your God is absolutely hopeless. Your God is a monad, nothing more than that. Your God is not only dependent on his names are dependent on us, on our creation. So what was he before Adam and Eve were created? Where was he? In fact, that's a good question. Where was Allah? Have you ever seen Allah? Has Allah ever entered time and space? See, they always wonder, how is it that our God can enter time? How can God come to earth? Have you heard that question? And if he was on earth, if God did come to earth, who was taking care of the universe? Who kept the universe running while he was on earth? Now you can see they've confused the Trinity again. And they assume that God the Father and God the Son and God the Holy Spirit, all 3 came down to earth in the form of Jesus. And then he came, he was first God the Father, then he became God the Son, all 3 wrapped up into one Godhead. And then he then returned back up to heaven as God the Holy Spirit, all 3. That's why they even asked the question, who is running the universe while God was on earth? Because the way they look at God, there is no triune God. Doesn't exist. God cannot act as 3 yet 1. And so they're imposing onto us their view of God. And that's why they ask the question. That's why you need to help them understand. Go right back to Scripture again. Go right back to Scripture and show where over and over again God was coming to earth. At the very beginning, God was on earth. That was God walking and talking in the cool of the day in Genesis chapter 3, verse 8 and 9. That was God calling out, where are you? Now, if God was walking, he better have a pair of legs. If he was talking and calling out, he better have a pair of lungs and certainly a mouth. Do you see the problem? If he was not, did not take on human form, then how could he even be in the garden calling out to Adam and Eve, where are you? What's interesting is take a look at those two little verses in chapter 3, and you can almost plug in a number of things about God right there. First of all, you can see that God is able to enter time and space. Can the Muslim God, Allah, enter time and space? No. At no point has Allah ever come to earth. Which suggests to me then that the God of the Bible can do anything he wants. Ooh, ta-ta-ta. Whereas the God of the Quran cannot. If God cannot come to earth, then he's not omnipotent. And Muslims have limited God. And I say to Muslims, don't ever in my presence say God can't come to earth. Maybe your God can't come to earth. Maybe Allah cannot come to earth. Then your God's too small. Get a bigger God. We got him. His name is Jesus Christ. Come on home. It's so easy. Because what if they're saying, and I remember I did a debate where this came up, and that was the very first question in the debate right there in Russia, in Kazan. And the clerics who were debating me at that time, they said, Mr. Smith, Allahu Akbar, God is the greater. God is the greater. But please, Mr. Smith, please don't say this infinite God, this God who is so great, took on human form and corrupted himself as a human. And I remember turning to my translator, because I don't speak a word of Russian. I said, just say to him, shame on you. He didn't want to do that. I said, no, you tell him, shame on you. Do not ever say in one sentence, Allahu Akbar, God is the greater, but he cannot become a man. Please don't say that in my presence, because you've just taken away his omnipotence. You've taken away his greatness. My God can become a man anytime he wants. And he did so right through history. He was there wrestling with Jacob. You better have a pair of legs. You better have a pair of hands if you're going to wrestle. He was there leading the children of Israel as a cloud during the day. See, he doesn't have to only take on human form. He can take on any form he wants. A cloud during the day and a pillar of fire during the night. He was in the burning bush with Moses. Oh, that's a good one you can use, because that's the bridge. You can go right into the Quran and go to chapter 20 of the Quran, because there's the same story in the Quran. See, the Quran, interestingly, is a book that has borrowed story after story after story. It has borrowed most of the material. Good 70% of the material is borrowed from other sources, and we know exactly where they borrowed them. But what's fascinating is when you look at that story, just open it up and how Muslims go to it and say, listen, now I'm going to show you two things about that story that you need to answer me. First and foremost, as Moses was coming close to the bush, a voice from within the bush in verse 10 says, Moses, take off your shoes, you on holy ground. Now hold on a minute. Can there be holy ground without God? No. By definition, if it's holy, God's there. Only where God is can it be holy, right? Can't be holy where you are. Can't be holy where I am. Can't be holy where you are. Only where God is can it be holy. So that assumes, therefore, that God was there. If they don't like that, go to verse 14. Because then in verse 14, the voice in the bush then says, truly, it is I am Allah who is speaking to you. Can anybody take on the name of Allah but God himself? According to Islam, absolutely not. So here you have a voice in the bush claiming that that place is holy, a voice in the bush claiming to be God. So ask your Muslim, was God in that bush? They have to say yes. If they say no, well, then you're going to have to tear out that story, and you can't do that to the Quran on pain of death. You do not desecrate the Quran. So immediately can you see what we've asked? Which means that was God in the bush. That bush is on earth. That incident happened in 1400 BC. And if God could come down to earth in 1400 BC, why in the world are they so confused or are upset if God came down 2,000 years ago and spent 33 years on earth? So you can use the Quran to your advantage. Say, listen, we don't have that problem in our Bible. Our God can come down over and over and over and over again. He came down over again to woo his people back to himself. He sent prophet after prophet, and then he finally came himself in the form of the Son of God, Jesus Christ, the Messiah. Died on the cross and rose again. Ooh, they don't like that. That's when they really get upset. The crucifixion. If you look at the Quran, it's very clear that there is no crucifixion. In chapter 4, verse 157. No crucifixion. For they killed him not. They thought it was so. Another was given his image, and truly he was not crucified. That's what it says in chapter 4, 157. So what are we going to do with that? Let me give you 5 answers real quickly. 5 things you can say quickly about that verse. First of all, you can look at another verse, chapter 19, verse 33. In chapter 19, by the way, are we being filmed for this? This is all being filmed. So if anybody, I do speak fast, so just put your pens down. You can get the film afterwards, and you can go and speed it down or just put it down so it's really nice and slow. That's what my Korean students always do, and I have a beautiful baritone. I wish I could speak like that. But that you can go ahead and slow it down and then just pick up all these verses as we go through. So there in chapter 19, verse 33, Jesus, Issa is his name, he's there as a little baby, and he's there in the crib. And he says to the crowd who's asking him where he came from, he said, "Blessed be me, the day I was born, the day I die, and the day I rise again." So there is Jesus referring to his birth, death, and resurrection. That confronts chapter 4, verse 157, doesn't it? It's a contradiction. Muslims cannot understand this. So what they do is they try to say, oh yeah, well, he's talking about the future. Well, of course he's talking about the future. He's a baby. That's not happened yet. He is going to die in 33 years. They would like to say this is a future rendering when he comes back another time. There's nothing in the verse to help them with that. You can see they have to impose on the text to get that out of it. And what's more, in chapter 3, verse 55, God is saying to Issa, "I will cause you to die." Mutawafika, that's the word in Arabic. Muta, mu means person, tawafik. Tawafik means to die. Ka, means you. I will cause you to die. It is as clear as day in Arabic. The only problem is every translation you read now has changed that to "I will cause you to sleep." But any Arab speaker knows mutawafik is always die. That does not mean sleep in Arabic. And they've had to change it since the 1930s because of the pressure from the governments saying we cannot have Jesus dying. We cannot have Jesus dying because that's an internal contradiction between chapter 3, verse 55 and chapter 4, verse 157. Ooh, I'm so glad we don't do that with our Bible. Can you imagine us changing the text, changing the verses so that we can get our theology correct? Thank goodness. And we're not talking about translations here, because the Arabic still retains, is still there. Mutawafika is still there in my Bible right here. Now, you'll see that there will be other questions about Jesus Christ. But let's stick with this crucifixion. That's the first problem. Internal contradiction between chapter 4, chapter 19, and chapter 3. Number 2, the second problem with the crucifixion. If Jesus did not die, what are you going to do with the historical record? The historical record is very clear. Every historian from that period did know that Jesus died. Just take a look at the 3 greatest historians that we look at when we look at the person of Jesus Christ. Thallus and Phlegon, they're both Greek historians that were debating this in 52 AD. That's just about 20 years after Christ's death. They were talking about that death. They mentioned that when Christ died, the sun went dark and the earth shook. So here's Greek historians that had no reason to admit or certainly to support the Christian record, and yet they are admitting that Jesus did die. You have Thallus and Phlegon, then you have Tacitus. Tacitus is a Roman historian. Tacitus did not like Christians. No, he didn't. He had nothing good to say about Christians in his annals. But what's fascinating, he does talk about the death of Jesus. And he mentions that the day that he mentions not only that Jesus died, but he mentions that it happened under the authority of Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. That's why we know it was in 33 AD, because of Tacitus. Josephus, a Jewish historian, talks about the death of Jesus and curiously mentions the fact that Christians thought he rose again. That's the only non-biblical record we have for the resurrection. So here you have Greek, Roman, and Hebrew or Jewish historians all supporting the death of Jesus. In fact, the question I always ask my Muslim friends is, can you find me one historian, just one, from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, up until the 7th century that denied the crucifixion of Jesus? Not one. The only reference to the fact that Jesus did not die is in chapter 4, 157 in the Quran, from the 7th, or as we're going to find out, probably 8th or 9th century. And you then understand why not only do you have internal contradictions, you have historical contradiction. What about the eyewitness account? Who was at the foot of the cross? Weren't there eyewitnesses there? Yeah, there was. John was there, wasn't he? John was the favorite disciple of Jesus. John had been with Jesus for 3 years. He was at the foot of the cross. Jesus spoke to him. Would not John have known who his Christ was? Would he have not known who the man on the cross was? Absolutely. Don't you think he would have said something if it was another man? And what about the mother of Jesus? She had known Jesus for 33 years. A mother knows her own son, and I don't hear anywhere in the reference there or anything that Jesus or Mary had any doubt that that was her son on the cross. And what about the man on the cross? Wouldn't he have said something? You got the wrong man. I'm not him. Help me. No, look and see what he said. Look at what he said on the cross. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Into your hands I commend my spirit. That does not sound like the wrong man. That does not sound like the man who is not guilty. That sounds like, I'm sorry, that's not the right word. He was not guilty to begin with. You're correct. But it does not sound like the man who was duped. He willingly went to the cross. He knew that he was to be on the cross. And that's why he was going home to be with his Father. But he had something to do first before he went home. Then we get to the fourth problem. And that is Jesus himself. What are you going to do with Issa? If he allows another one to take his place, doesn't die on the cross, but then 3 days later goes into the upper room, introduces himself to the disciples as if he was it, claiming to be the man who died and rose again. A week later, even when Thomas questioned him, he showed the holes in his hands and the holes in his feet. What kind of prophet lies like that? Not my Jesus. My Jesus doesn't lie like that. They've got the wrong Jesus. They think that that's the historical record. And then fifthly, and this is the hardest one for Muslims to know what to do with, and this is the moral argument, somewhat like the fourth one. If Allah took the image of another man and put Jesus' image on him and let that man die in Jesus' place and then told no one about it, and for 600 years told nobody about it, what kind of God is that? That's a deceitful God. That is not the God of the Bible. I don't see anywhere in the Bible where God is deceitful. Do you? Not my God. They've got the wrong God. And it looks like they've got Allah, because that's the God of the Quran. Take a look and see how much that God deceives. In fact, that's quite normal for Allah to do. In fact, it says in the Quran that God is above deception. There are a number of references. I could give them to you right here where God is deceitful. Chapter 3, verse 54. Chapter 8, verse 30. Chapter 10, verse 21. Chapter 3, verse 28. All of these are the deceitfulness of God, the deceitfulness of God, the deceitfulness of Allah. That Allah is above deceit. He cannot be held accountable to the same standard that we are held accountable, because he is God alone. Which suggests that we're talking about two different gods, aren't we? The God of the Quran is not the God of the Bible. The God of the Quran has nothing to do with the God of the Bible, and I never want to hear people say that we share the same God. I will have nothing to do with that God. And the reason why I'm coming down so hard on the crucifixion is because the crucifixion is what the Muslims attack us with. They don't confront us with the resurrection, because they don't believe that there was any resurrection. If Jesus didn't die, of course he didn't rise again. He was always alive. So we've got to deal with the crucifixion. I know you've been told that we must spend all our time with the resurrection, but that's with atheists and that's with humanists. With Muslims, you've got to confront the crucifixion. So just use these 5 points against them. Now we come to the part that Gary wanted me to get into, and that is the problem with the Quran itself, this book right here. Gary, I didn't ask permission to bring this in the room. Is that okay? It's not going to hurt anybody. It's pretty small. I keep it smaller than my Bible. You can see why in a few minutes. This is the book that's causing all the problems, and this is the book that we've got to confront, and this is the book that we are confronting. And what we're finding out about this book is amazing. Now, there's some stuff that I'm going to introduce tonight you've never heard before. And the reason why is because I've never heard of it before until just recently. And I spent 37 years confronting this book. I did my doctoral thesis on this book. And yet when I was doing my doctorate, when I was doing my master's also on the Quran, we never had the material that we have today. We never had this kind of material to use against the Quran. And a question you may ask is, why even talk about the Quran? Gary, could I get some water? Maybe a glass of water so I can just, or can I use this? Is this okay? There's no arsenic in it, is there? So when you look at the Quran, you need to do a comparison between these two books real quickly. And when you look at these two books, you can see they really are completely two different categories of literature. We would never make the claims about the Bible that the Muslims make about the Quran. And so let's start with their claims. The Quran, they say, is eternal. Who knows why they say it's eternal? Does anybody know the reason? Any idea? Say again? In tablets up in heaven. And that's in the Quran itself, isn't it? In chapter 85, verse 22. So it's an internal claim. It's not something that they have made up. It actually is internal to the Quran. The Quran makes that claim. So they've got to adhere to it. In chapter 85, verse 22, it talks about these eternal tablets. Now, by definition, if something is eternal, does that not mean it's co-equal to God? It's a conflict, isn't it? This is a duality. Only God is eternal. Am I correct? I've always been told that only God is eternal. So how can you have an inanimate object, a tablet, from which this book is derived, that is co-eternal with God? That means that claim in chapter 85, verse 22, is committing shirk. Shirk is the Arabic name for adding or putting alongside another with God. Anytime you equate a thing or a person with God, that is shirk. Someone who does that is a mushrik. The people who do that are mushrikun. We are mushrikun. That's the name they give us. Because they say we have elevated a prophet, Jesus, to the status of divinity. Therefore, we're mushriks. We have committed shirk. Well, the Quran has committed shirk. And there was a group in the 10th century called the Mu'tazilites who did say that. They actually looked at that verse and they said, we've got to tear that out. That can't remain. Because how can you have a thing co-equal with God? How can you have something equal, eternal? Only God is eternal, and that's one of his definitions. That defines him. If you're going to have a tablet that's co-eternal, you have committed shirk. We have to tear that out. When they brought this to Mamun's court in the 9th century, the Qadarites, who were the ones who were an ascendancy at that time, killed every one of the Mu'tazilites. That's what they do in Islam. When they don't like something, they don't just sit there and debate it. They actually kill you. It's very clear. When you leave Islam, you get killed. It's called an apostate law. And anybody who's an apostate must be put to death. And that's in the Quran, chapter 4, verse 89. He who leaves Islam, kill him. Very simple. Every school of law, the Hanbali, the Hanafi, the Maliki, and the Shafi school, all four schools of law dictate that anybody who leaves Islam is an apostate. Apostates must be executed. The only difference between the four schools is which day you do it. Some say immediately, like the Hanbali school. The Hanafi and the Maliki school say that it must be in 3 days, and the Shafi school gives 10 days. That's it. But you must be executed. You must be executed. They do not take criticism. They do not take rejection. And that's why it's fascinating that those who actually brought this up as a problem in the 10th century were all killed off, all destroyed. And then the Qadarites shut down ijtihad. Ijtihad means to interpret the scriptures, and therefore no one could interpret scripture then for 1,000 years. Until 1905, when finally Muhammad Abduh in Cairo at Al-Azhar University reopened ijtihad. It is now open today. And so we're permitted now to critique the Quran. We're permitted now to actually ask these kind of questions. And you have all the right in the world to ask Muslims, what about that verse? Look at that verse. Does that not create a duality? Is that not suggest, therefore, there's someone else besides God, the eternal, and it's your book? So that's the first claim they make, that it is eternal. Secondly, the second claim they make is that it was sent down to a man named Muhammad between 610 and 632, or 22 years. So for 20 years, 610 to 622, where he was revealed, this revelation came to him in Mecca, and then 622 to 632, the last 10 years, this revelation came to him in Medina. 2 cities, Mecca, Medina, yeah. The Quran does talk about Gabriel quite a few times. Right there in chapter 19, that's Gabriel that comes to Mary. Jibril is his name in Arabic. So the source is the Quran itself. But the stories about Gabriel would be the hadith, yes. Doesn't say too much. It just says that he talks to Mary and says to her that she's going to have a righteous son. That's interesting. That's in chapter 19, verse 19. And in verse 20, he says to Mary, you will be a virgin when this happens. Truly, you are a virgin. So that's beautiful because that's a bridge you can use to look at why the birth of Jesus is unique. So Gabriel is in the Quran. Jibril would the name would be. But also, Jibril is also known as the Spirit of God. Ru'ala. Now put that under your hat. So is he a spirit or is he an angel? Malaka. Both and. There's a lot of confusion in the Quran. Don't ask me to explain it. Ask Muslims. Let them have to deal with it. I'm so glad I don't have to defend the Quran. Now let's get back to this thing. So he is eternal. He is sent down to, the Quran is eternal. The Quran is sent down to a man named Muhammad for between 610 and 632, 22-year period. But Muhammad, curiously, did not write it down during his lifetime. And the reason they say is because he could not read or write. Is that a good excuse? Have any of you, does anybody here read and write Arabic? Okay. I don't speak Arabic, but I read and write Arabic, and it took me 2 weeks to read and write Arabic. There are only 28 letters in the Arabic alphabet. 7 of them are unique. All the others require either dots above or below the lines. 22 of them. 6 of them are unique. The other 22 require dots. It's not difficult to learn. It's not a very difficult script. So Muhammad would have had 22 years to learn the script. He already spoke it fluently. He was Arab. He grew up with Arabic. To read and write it would have not been at all difficult. Why didn't he learn to read and write it? If this was his only remit, this was his major remit in life. This was the one thing he was supposed to do, is receive this book and get it written down. He did not. So when he died, the Quran still had not been written down. It had been memorized by many of the companions. It was written on stones, on bones, on leaves, on bark. And all that I know because of Al-Bukhari, chapter 6 or volume 6, hadith number 509 and 510. So here you have a prophet, supposed prophet, who was given this eternal tablet that was then sent down to him piecemeal by an angel Gabriel, given to him in 2 different cities. He forgets to write it down and then dies in 632, unwritten. Which then means the first caliph that comes after him, Abu Bakr, is given that responsibility. And Abu Bakr takes on that responsibility. And he then takes the scribe of Muhammad. So Muhammad had a secretary. Isn't that interesting? So why didn't the secretary write it down while he was living? Isn't that the job of secretaries? Ask your Muslim question these. I have yet to see a Muslim that can explain this to me. Either Muhammad was inept, or he was such a proud man that he thought that he didn't need to write it down, but that's rather clumsy with God's greatest revelation and the final revelation on top of that. So Abu Bakr, 2 years after Muhammad's death, had Zayd ibn Thabit go and find out everybody that had memorized and write down what their memory was, and then write down what he found on stones and bones and bark. Stones, bones, and bark. And put the first copy, the first recension of the Quran together. So that was done in 632 to 634, 2 years after Muhammad died. That copy was then given to one of the wives of Muhammad. Her name was Hafsa. She put it under her bed. Why? We don't know. It's obviously she didn't want to read it. If this was the greatest revelation finally written down, why don't you think she would have been curious enough to read it? What we do know is that 20 years later, at the time 652 then, the third caliph comes to power. Abu Bakr dies. Umar takes over from 634 to 644. He is killed. Uthman, the third caliph, takes over in 644, and he rules till 656. Now in 652, word has come to him that there are a multiplicity of Qurans that don't agree with the one that is given to Hafsa. But how does he know, since he doesn't have Hafsa's Quran? It's under her bed all this time. Nonetheless, they know that there are disagreements. So he says, okay, I want you to get Hafsa's copy. So he had Zayd ibn Thabit go and get Hafsa's copy, one of the wives of Muhammad. She gives it to them. So this is 20 years later. And he says, take that copy and rewrite it again. Why do you need to rewrite it if it's already written? And if you have any disagreement amongst you, and there was 4 of them that were given that responsibility, Zaid ibn Thabit, the secretary, Allah Zubair and Harith, 3 others. The 4 of them were to rewrite the Quran again using Hafsa's copy, and if there were any disagreements, they were to rewrite it in the Qurayshi dialect. Now, none of you speak Arabic here, but if you did speak Arabic, you'd know that immediately there's a problem there, because dialectic differences, by definition, require dots above and below the line. That's how you get dialectic differences. Even more so, they require vowelization, the dhamma, the u sound. Dhamma, the u sound, which is a little curly Q above the line. The fatha, the a sound, which is a little sliver above the line. And the kasra, the e sound, which is a little tick below the line. U, a, e. Those are the 3 vowels in Arabic. That's it, only 3 vowels. Everything else is consonantal. Consonant after consonant after consonant. So how can you have dialectic differences in the 7th century when there were no diacritical marks in the 7th century? There was no vowelizations. Those weren't invented till the 8th and 9th century, 100 to 200 years later. Are you following me? No, not many of you. I can see I'm losing all of you. That's all right. You don't really have to know this. People like me have to know this, because this is where we're hammering the Muslims. They have no idea how to answer that. And yet there it is. Write it in, if you have any dialectical differences, write it in the Qurayshi dialect. The reason why no one gets this, and the reason why even the Arabs certainly don't want to talk about it, is because that portion, that story, comes from a man named Al-Bukhari in the late 9th century. That's 240 years later. None of that we know about the Quran comes from the 7th century. We know nothing about the Quran from the 7th century. There's no writing whatsoever about any Quran at all in the same century that the Muhammad lived. It's all what they thought happened 240 years later, 870, redating it back to 632 and 652. Can you see a problem here? Are you starting to see the problem that's rising? Now, so they write the Quran in the Qurayshi dialect. Then Uthman goes and takes all the other manuscripts of the Quran and he burns them. Does that bother any of you? Why do you burn manuscripts? Any idea? To get rid of what evidence? Anything that disagrees. Am I correct? So obviously there must have been something that disagreed. Otherwise, what did he burn? Am I correct? Muslims, they strenuously try to deny that. No, that's not what he was burning. No, these are nothing more than dialectical differences that he was burning. There were no dialectical differences. Okay, these are nothing more than different ways of reading it. There is no way to read it if you don't have any ways to delineate the readings. That doesn't come in for another 100 to 200 years. And every time they make an excuse, we hammer them. That's why no Muslim will debate me on this anymore. They dare not debate us on this. They cannot debate us on this. And we're just getting started, folks. This is only the few of the first problems. So once they do that then, Uthman then commissions the one copy to be made into several copies, to one copy to be sent into every province of his kingdom. Now when you look at a map, you will see that there were 9 provinces at the time of Uthman. Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, Alexandria, Aden, Herat, and Nishapur. Did you count 9? I counted 9. 9. 9 Qurans to 9 cities. When I was learning Islam and when I was getting my master's and doing my doctorate, I was only told there were 4 Qurans to 4 cities. Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, and Medina. That's it. That's what I always was told. I had no idea that there were actually 9 cities at the time of Uthman. That means they have to show us, therefore, 9 Qurans from the time of Uthman. Because you're only talking about 1,400 years ago. That's not very long ago, is it? When you're talking about manuscripts. Remember, these are not papyrus. None of these are papyrus. These are vellum, these are parchment, these are manuscripts, these are codices that are written on animal skin. Animal skin is durable. If you have any doubt, take a look at what we have for parchment and vellum when it comes to the biblical manuscripts. Look and see what we've got in the British Library. Come to London, where I've been living for the last 25 years. Go look at the British Library, and you'll see the Sinaiticus right there, which is part of our tour. When we go people through the British Museum and the British Library, you'll see the Sinaiticus, the entire New Testament, from the time of the 4th century, between 325 and 350 AD. That is 300 years before the Quran. It is as pristine today as the day it was written. There's no blemish in it. It's a beautiful book. Right next to it is the Alexandrinus. The Alexandrinus is both the Old and the New Testament from the 5th century. That's 200 years before the Quran. If we could come up with those two manuscripts just in the British Library, you want to go down to the Vatican, and you have the Vaticanus, which is, again, the New Testament, much like the Sinaiticus from the 4th century, though they're known as the three metropolitan codices. They are all 3 to 400 years before the Quran. What's fascinating is we can come up with 365 manuscripts of the New Testament alone, either partial or complete before the 6th century. All we're asking the Muslims is one, just one of those 9 from the 7th century. One manuscript from the mid-7th century, complete and unchanged. That's all I'm asking. Is that too much to ask? Absolutely not. You mentioned the Birmingham folios. Do you know the dates for them? 568 to 645. When was Muhammad born? 570, died in 632. Okay, what's the problem with that manuscript right there? He's talking about the Birmingham folios. There's just 2 folios from Surah 18, 19, and 20, which was discovered in in Birmingham, but it was discovered by carbon dating in the Oxford lab in 2015. 568 to 645. Do you see the problem with that? You notice no Muslim scholar has supported those dates. Why do you think? Well, Muhammad was there in 570. No, remember, what did I say? When was the Quran written down in its final form? 652. So if the latest date of these carbon datings, the very latest date is 645, that's 7 years before 652. You can't have a manuscript or even folios that predate Uthman. And the only ones who got all up in arms, got so excited about it, was the BBC. Western scholars who didn't know the dates for Muhammad. That's why Muslim scholars have become very silent. They haven't said anything about it. It gets even worse than that. What's your name? Greg, it gets even worse than that, Greg. If you want to look and see, there's not just the Oxford lab. There's also the laboratory in Kiel, the Oxford lab. There's also the laboratory in Lille, and there's also the lab in Zurich. 4 different labs, all in Europe. They have now looked at the Sana manuscript, which is even older than the Birmingham folios. In fact, the Birmingham folios are supposedly from the Sana manuscript, and they've taken a look and they've done carbon dating on all 4 laboratories. Guess what the date they have for those carbon datings? Every one of them is prior to 550. Every one of them. The latest date for all of them is 550. They go all the way back to 443. 443 to 550. Muhammad was even born to 570. All 4 of those labs, the carbon datings for those manuscripts are before Muhammad's life, before the Quran was put. We've even begun. The Quran was begun in 610. Before the Quran was finished in 652. Before Islam even became. Do you see the problems? Be careful with carbon datings. We would never use carbon datings for our manuscripts because they're so inexact. But more than that, the fact that these three surahs that you're talking about, 18, 19, and 20, look at the stories that are in those 3 surahs. You have the story of Moses at the burning bush. You have the story of the 7 sleepers in Ephesus. And you have the story of Dhul Qarnayn, who's Alexander the Great. Now, none of these are unique to the Quran, are they? They're all borrowed. But those stories would have all predated the Quran, wouldn't they? So even if you went with the carbon datings, that means these are all older than the Quran because the stories are older. If you're borrowing, that means they were there beforehand. Ooh, I love it. It just makes my job so easy. So be careful of any type of scientific evidence that goes against what we're now finding out with paleographical evidence. Now, Greg, just continue on from that. Can you then see why Muslims have now kept quiet about these new findings in Kiel, in Zurich, in Lille, and also in Oxford? It's all over, yeah. In fact, it's public information in that the people that are putting it public don't want their names to go with it because they know that they could have death threats. It's published, though. It's right out there. But let's continue on. Regardless of the carbon datings, and the carbon datings are so inexact, no one's using them anymore, let's go back and let's find out what we do know. What do we know about these 9 manuscripts? We can't find any of them. However, we can find 6 of them that do not come from the 7th century, but the 6 oldest manuscripts that do exist in the world today. Does anybody know what the 6 are, or even one of the 6 are? The Sana, that's one. That's in Yemen. No, not the Birmingham. That's just 2 folios. Topkapi in Istanbul, Turkey. The Petropolitanus in Paris. This man's good. Oh, you took my course. Okay. All right. Well, then you're a good student if you remembered all these. So that's 3 of them. You're halfway there. What's the one in London? The Ma'il. Okay, Ma'il in London. And there's one more real famous one. In Cairo, that's the Husseini. Not so famous, but you're missing the most famous, and that's the Tashkent one. The Samarkand in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. So you have the Topkapi, which is in Turkey. You have the Samarkand, which is in Tashkent. You have the Ma'il, which is in London. The Petropolitanus, which is in Paris. The Husseini, which is in Cairo. And then the best one, my favorite one, is the Sana'a, which is in Yemen. The newest one that was discovered in just 1975, when they were washing out the dome of the mosque there in Sana'a. They found a trapdoor. They opened the trapdoor, and thousands or hundreds, maybe not thousands, hundreds of manuscripts fell to the ground, which is not uncommon. Whenever Qurans start to deteriorate, they hide them up in the mosque domes, and they just leave them up there and they forget them. These had all been forgotten. Most of them were not very old, but the ones that were the most exciting were a number of very, very old manuscripts. They had no diacritical marks, they had no vowelization, proving that they were probably from the 8th or 9th or possibly 10th century. But they couldn't read them because there was no diacritical marks, so they had to fly down 3 German scholars, Dr. Gerd Prin, Dr. von Bothmer, and Dr. Oleg. They flew them down in 1981 to look at these manuscripts and to film them. And they filmed them immediately because they realized that these are the oldest manuscript that they'd ever come across. It was using the Hijazi script, which is a much, much older script. They had no diacritical marks. They had no vowelization, which was to be expected. They pictured every page by page, and the Yemeni government overheard what they were saying, and they confiscated all their microfilms. And they did not release those microfilms until 1997. Upon which I went to Germany to talk to them and looked at them, and they gave me some of the facsimiles of what they had found. And boy, has it become juicy. Now, we'll get into that, but let's continue with these 6 manuscripts. What do we know about these 6 manuscripts? We didn't know too much until recently because we had no access to these 6 manuscripts. We were finally given access, not us, but the Muslim scholars, Dr. Tahir Atakuluc and Dr. Ekmel Nisanalu, 2 of the world's foremost Muslim scholars on the Arabic text, were given access in 2002. And for 5 years, they looked at these manuscripts. They studied all 6 of them. They did forensic testing on them, and they came up with their conclusions in 2007. That was printed up in 2009. It was translated into English in 2013. I then got hold of it in 2014, and I quickly challenged Dr. Shabir Ali to a debate on these 6 manuscripts. We did that in September of 2014. It's been up there 4 years now, and all the damage was done within the first 50 minutes of that debate. The reason why is that this is the first time we were able to look at that manuscript. And what we found out is that those manuscripts, and what we found out is that not one of those 6 manuscripts was from the 7th century. Not one of them. Not one of them are these 9 that were sent to 9 different cities. What's more, not one of them was complete. And most devastating, not one of them agreed with each other. And not one of them agreed completely with this book right here. This is the modern Quran. This is the Hafs text. So where did this book come from? Anybody know where this book comes from? Cairo, Egypt. You are correct. This is the Cairene text. This is the Hafs text. Now, how many of you knew this before tonight? You did, because you've been following me and you've been my student. The Hafs text is the canonical text of the Quran that I have in my hand today. But this text was only chosen in 1924. That's 94 years ago. In Cairo, because there in Cairo, in the high schools, there was such a multiplicity of Arabic Qurans. There was 37 different Arabic Qurans. No, notice, I'm not saying translations. I'm saying Arabic Qurans. These are the original text. There was 37 different Arabic Qurans that they were using, the students were using, that they could not have standardized tests because there are so many differences. We have already counted 60,000 differences between the 37 because we have 31 of them in our possession today. We have salvaged 31 of them in London. Hatun Tash is the one that is responsible for that, from Turkey. And we have our Arabic scholars looking at them, and they've already found 60,000 differences. Back in 1924, it was obvious something needed to be done. There was such a multiplicity of different Qur'ans. So they asked Al-Azhar University, considered to be the greatest Islamic university in the world today, to choose one of the 37. And they chose the one called Hafs. Who is Hafs? Hafs is a student who died in 796, late 8th century. That's 144 years after Muhammad. Never knew Muhammad. Came from Kufa. Didn't even live where Muhammad lived. Lived hundreds of miles away and hundreds of years later. And it was his text that was chosen as the official text for all the high schools in Cairo in 1924. What did they do with all the other texts? They took them all, they took them to the Nile, and they drowned them. They're still in the Nile today, the Nile River. This time they didn't burn them, they drowned them. So whenever you find a Quran that doesn't agree, you either burn it or drown it. That was done 94 years ago. By 1936, they realized that what they had done in Cairo was so successful, because now they could get standardized tests, that they decided to make it nationwide. So all of Egypt then was given the Hafs text. And it was known as the Farouk text, named after King Farouk, who became king in 1936 to 1952. But that was just Egypt. In 1985, in Saudi Arabia, they saw what was happening in Egypt, and they realized that that was so successful in Egypt, they wanted to make this worldwide. So King Fahd, the king at that time in 1985, took the Hafs text and standardized it and canonized it as the official text for all Qurans all over the world. That was only 33 years ago. Which means some of you in this room are older than the Quran. Ooh, Put that under your hat. And yet the Muslims tell us the Quran is eternal. The Muslims tell us it was sent down to a man named Muhammad. The Muslims tell us that it was compiled at the time of Uthman. The Muslims tell us it has never changed. The Quran we have today is exactly like that one in heaven. Can you see from what I've just told you in the last half hour that we can destroy the Quran and every one of those pronouncements? And it's only taken me 30 minutes to do it. And all of you understand what I've said. I've not even got into the nitty-gritty. I've not even got into where the differences are. I've not even got into how many variants there are. But we're going to come up with something in November that's going to destroy even more. I can't tell you too much about it. Even Gary is why he wants me to say much about it. What we now are doing is looking at the original canonical text. That means the actual, not the canonical. That's not the right word. Consonantal. the consonantal text. That's the original text with no diacritical marks, with no vowelization. We have now pictures of over 4,000 variants within the 6 major manuscripts. We have not shown them to the world. We have not done like with like, showing every one of the manuscripts. There are thousands of erasers, words, entire sentences that have been erased. There are thousands of insertions, words, phrases, sentences, paragraphs that have been inserted at a later date. There are thousands of coverings and tapings where they've taped over entire portions of the Quranic text, covering where they have covered over entire sentences. Wouldn't you love to pick it up to see what they're covering? At times they've covered and written over top a completely different sentence. Thousands of these, 4,000 to be exact. These we're going to introduce worldwide in November. It'll be the first time that Muslims will be able to see them. And what we're doing is we're taking slide by slide every variant and putting it next to the Hafs text, showing exactly where they change. So even you who do not read Arabic, you can just visually see the differences. Then we'll show you what each one says. And then we'll show you how it's changed the text and how it's changed the theology. This will be the first time that Muslims all over the world will have to pay attention. This is going into a software that you can get on your own computer. You will have access. It's called Quranic Gateway. It's been put out by Rabbi Zacharias Ministries. We're the ones that are doing the work for him. I'm not doing it. I'm the only one that's actually doing the comparisons. But can you see what this is going to do to the Quran in just a few months? No Muslim will be able to say that that Quran comes from heaven or from Muhammad or from Uthman or even from the first 13 centuries. The only thing they can say is the Quran we have in our hand today is only 94 years old. Prince Philip in England is older than that Quran. And the canonical Quran, the one that every Muslim is using around the world, many of you in this room are older than it. Thank God we don't have this problem. Gary, over to you.